The sound of crystal glasses should have been a melody of celebration. Instead, it was the overture to my undoing. "I've decided," Richard said, his voice smooth and practiced, "to start a new life without you." The words fell into the hush of the restaurant, slicing through the soft clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversation. His champagne flute trembled slightly in his hand, catching the golden light from the window. The crowd, our friends, colleagues, family, froze. All 50 faces turned toward me, waiting for the outburst, the tears, the public collapse. After all, that's how these scenes are supposed to go, isn't it? But I didn't give them that. I smiled. The kind of smile that belongs to a woman who has already outgrown her husband's cruelty. "Congratulations," I said softly, "on your honesty." Laughter didn't come, not even nervous applause. Just silence, thick, suffocating silence. "My name is Vivian Hartley. I am 54 years old, and until that moment, I had been the perfect wife, devoted, graceful, endlessly accommodating. If you've made it this far, I'm glad you're here. Give this story a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far truth can travel, because the one I'm about to tell you tore through my family like a wildfire that refused to die. I had postponed promotions, turned down opportunities, and raised our daughter Clara, while Richard reinvented himself from architect to wine importer to self-proclaimed visionary. For 28 years, I had kept the facade shining. Clara sat beside me, her graduation cap still perched slightly askew on her head, her expression frozen between confusion and disbelief. The restaurant, the Sea Glass, overlooked the Pacific, a place Richard had chosen because he wanted the setting to be memorable. Oh, it would be memorable, all right. I reached into my clutch and withdrew a sealed cream-colored envelope, thick and heavy. I laid it beside his plate. He blinked, confused. "What's this?" "Something for you to read later." Then I leaned toward Clara, kissed her cheek, and whispered, "This day is still about you, sweetheart. Don't let him take that away." I rose, smoothed my ivory silk dress, and turned to the guests, people who had smiled in my home, eaten my food, and apparently known about his affair, long before I did. "Please," I said, my voice steady, "enjoy your meal. I wish you all a lovely afternoon." And I walked out. The restaurant doors closed behind me with a hush like the sea drawing breath before a storm. Outside, the California air was hot, heavy with salt and eucalyptus. I stood for a moment on the terrace, looking out at the endless blue horizon, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: oxygen. Then I heard the door slam behind me. "Vivian!" Richard's voice cracked, all bravado gone. "What the hell is this? What have you done?" I didn't turn around. I let him shout, let the panic seep into his tone. The envelope contained his ruin: every transfer, every lie, every ounce of arrogance turned into paper and ink. What I had done wasn't revenge. It was arithmetic. 3 months earlier, I'd noticed the numbers didn't add up. I'd been a senior financial consultant for 20 years before giving it up for him. Balancing accounts was second nature. Tiny withdrawals from our joint savings had begun appearing, always disguised as business expenses, client entertainment, miscellaneous. But I knew better. I'd traced the trail through shell accounts, small transfers, corporate cards. I'd followed it all the way to Nina Sloan, his bright, ambitious assistant, 20 years younger, who had attended our Christmas party last year and complimented my shoes. The same woman whose laugh had lingered a little too long in the hallway whenever Richard's office door was half closed. I could have confronted him. I didn't. Instead, I documented everything, every expense, every message, every careless word. The irony was delicious. Richard had once insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Just in case, he'd said. He'd wanted to protect his potential wealth. But at the time, it was my inheritance that had kept us afloat. And hidden deep within that document was a clause: fidelity, binding for the life of the marriage. He'd forgotten it existed. I never had. By the time I slid into my car and shut the door, I could hear him shouting after me, his voice echoing across the parking lot. I started the engine. The Pacific glimmered beyond the bluff, wide and endless. I exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel. "Here's to new beginnings," I murmured. As I drove down the coastal highway, the sunlight flashing off the water, I realized something profound. Richard thought he was making an announcement. He didn't realize he'd just delivered my liberation. The drive home from the Sea Glass felt like surfacing after years underwater. Every familiar landmark, our favorite cafe, the palm-lined boulevard, the curved roads leading up to Cliffside Drive, looked the same, yet felt newly foreign. I wasn't driving back to a home. I was driving back to a stage, set about to be struck. Our house sat perched on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, a pristine colonial revival with wraparound balconies and white shutters, the kind of house that photographs well in magazines, the kind that hides decay behind symmetry. I parked in the circular driveway, the sound of the tires on gravel crisp and final. Inside, the air was cool and still, scented faintly of gardenias from the vase I'd arranged that morning. Everything was in its place: the framed wedding photos on the mantel, the antique piano I'd inherited from my mother, the family portrait taken 2 summers ago in Big Sur. Richard's arm around me, his eyes bright, his hand resting just a little too possessively on my shoulder. Now those eyes made me feel nothing. I walked up the staircase, the rhythm of my heels steady on the hardwood. In our bedroom, his suitcase was waiting in the closet, already packed pressed shirts, leather shoes, a navy suit, toiletries tucked neatly into a travel case. He had planned everything. He was going to announce his departure in front of everyone, collect his applause for finding himself, and leave the next morning with his new muse. He was so predictable, it almost bored me. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. The spreadsheet I'd prepared glowed on the screen, a ledger of betrayal. 12 months of transfers, over $86,000, moved to a private account in Nina Sloan's name. Jewelry purchases, weekend getaways to Monterey, an attempted down payment on a beachfront property in Carmel. He'd even used my mother's inheritance to fund their secret. What he didn't know was that the account he'd been drawing from the one he thought was joint had been quietly rerouted through my personal oversight. Every transfer he made, I copied and archived. Every digital footprint, I tracked. By the time I'd served him the papers, the court already had everything they needed. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. 32 unread messages. Most were from people at the restaurant. A few were from friends pretending to be shocked, offering sympathy wrapped in curiosity. And one, from Clara. "Mom, Dad's saying awful things. He's telling everyone you planned this. Please tell me what's going on." I typed back, "Sweetheart, I'm fine. I promise. This isn't your burden. Enjoy your day. I'll explain everything tonight. I love you." I hit send, took a deep breath, and closed my eyes. I remembered when I first fell in love with Richard. It was 1988. He was a young architect with a sketchbook full of ideas and a smile that could convince anyone to believe in his dreams. He'd asked me to invest in his first firm. I had, using part of my trust fund. When it failed 2 years later, I told myself failure was noble. That loyalty mattered more than money. 28 years later, I knew better. The sound of tires on gravel broke the silence. I looked out the window. His car. He was home sooner than I expected. I closed the laptop, the screen dimming to black just as the front door slammed open. "Vivian!" His voice boomed through the foyer. "Where the hell are you?" I walked downstairs slowly, the calm in my voice deliberate. In the living room, he appeared in the doorway, red-faced, the envelope crushed in his hand. "You served me divorce papers? Today? At Clara's graduation?" "It seemed appropriate," I said. "You wanted to start your new life. I'm just helping facilitate it." "You've lost your mind." "No," I replied evenly. "I've just found it." He took a step closer, waving the papers. "You can't do this. The prenup expired years ago." "Actually," I said, folding my arms, "it didn't. Section 12 fidelity clause. It remains binding for the duration of the marriage. Your lawyer should have told you that." "Oh wait, you didn't consult one, did you?" His face blanched. "That clause will cost you everything," I finished for him. "The house, the vacation property, your share of the retirement accounts." He sank into the armchair, his hand trembling. "Vivian, we built this life together." I tilted my head. "Did we? Or did I build it while you played visionary?" For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, fear, or maybe understanding. Then his phone buzzed. He ignored it. I didn't have to ask who it was. "You always were calculating," he said bitterly. "But this is ice cold." "No," I said softly. "It's math." He rose abruptly, storming toward the door. "I need to make some calls." Try your attorney, I said. Oh, and one more thing, your sister Evelyn knows everything. You might want to call her too. He froze. Evelyn? She saw you and Nina together at the Harvest Gala. She came to me first, hoping you'd come clean. You didn't. His jaw tightened. Everyone's betraying me. I smiled faintly. Ironic, isn't it? He turned and left without another word. When the door shut, the silence that followed was absolute. I exhaled, long and deep. And for the first time in decades, the house felt like mine again. I picked up the phone, dialed a familiar number, and waited. Evelyn? I said when she answered. It's done. By the time I reached Evelyn's house, the Pacific had turned the color of steel. Her small bungalow perched on a hill in Delcrest, wrapped in ivy and surrounded by rose bushes she tended with almost obsessive care. I had called her hours earlier, my voice calm, telling her I might need a place to stay for a night or two. When she opened the door, she didn't ask questions. She simply stepped aside, ushering me in with a look that said she'd been expecting this moment for years. Wine or whiskey? She asked. Whichever feels like victory, I said. She poured 2 glasses of red, the kind that leaves slow trails on the side of the glass, and handed one to me as we sank into the worn leather armchairs by her fireplace. I saw the video, she said after a moment. Video? Her lips twitched into a humorless smile. Someone at the restaurant recorded it. It's making its rounds through Hollow Bay faster than a brush fire. I closed my eyes. Of course they had. The digital age made sure humiliation traveled at light speed. Evelyn leaned back, her gaze steady. You handled it better than any woman I've ever seen. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. Good. Let him squirm. She reached out, touching my hand lightly. I warned him, Vivian. Months ago. Told him I'd seen him with that girl. I know, I said quietly. You did the right thing. Did I? She sighed. He said it was a misunderstanding, that you two were fine, that she was just a colleague. I gave a small laugh, dry as sandpaper. He's been rewriting truth for so long. He thinks it's an art form. Evelyn studied me for a long moment. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? I didn't deny it. 3 months. The finances didn't add up. Once I realized where the money was going, I started gathering evidence, quietly. Her eyes softened with admiration. You always did have a gift for precision. I used to think that precision made me controlling, I said, staring into the fire. Now I realize it's what saved me. For a while, we sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the ocean below the cliffs. Then Evelyn said, You know he's going to try to fight this. Men like Richard, they can't stand losing control, especially to the woman they underestimated. I'm counting on it, I said. The more he fights, the deeper he'll sink. The prenup, the evidence, the bank records, it's all in motion now. Evelyn smirked. Remind me never to cross you. I smiled faintly. But the truth was, I felt hollow. The adrenaline that had carried me through the day was ebbing, leaving behind exhaustion and something colder grief for a marriage that had died long before I buried it. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Clara's name flashed across the screen. Mom? Her voice was tight, trembling. Dad's saying awful things about you. He's telling people you've gone crazy, that you trapped him, that you've been planning this for years. I swallowed. Let him talk. The truth will find its way, even if he can't face it yet. Can I come over? Of course, I said softly. Always. When Clara arrived half an hour later, still in her white graduation dress, mascara smudged and eyes swollen, she didn't speak. She just walked straight into my arms. I didn't want to ruin your day, I whispered. She pulled back, her voice breaking. He ruined it himself. Evelyn gave us space, slipping quietly into the kitchen. Clara sat down beside me, and for the first time, I told her everything about the money, the affair, the documents. I didn't spare details. She deserved the truth. When I finished, she sat silent for a long moment. Then, softly, she said, I always thought he adored you. So did I replied. She clenched her fists. He doesn't deserve you. I smiled faintly. No, but I'm done needing to be deserved. From the kitchen came the sound of Evelyn pouring more wine. To endings, she called. Clara turned to me, her eyes glistening but fierce. No, she said. To beginnings. I raised my glass. To both. The three of us clinked our glasses in the soft glow of the fire, and for the first time since the toast that shattered my life, I felt something steady like the earth beneath me had finally stopped trembling. The night air outside Evelyn's bungalow was thick with mist rolling in from the ocean, wrapping the coastline in a ghostly hush. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers. Clara had fallen asleep on the couch, her hand still clutching her phone. I was half dozing myself when the doorbell rang, a harsh, insistent sound that ripped through the quiet like a blade. Evelyn looked at me, brows furrowed. Who the hell? I was already standing. He wouldn't, but he would. When I opened the door, Richard stood there on the porch, his suit jacket wrinkled, hair disheveled, eyes bloodshot from fury or drink, maybe both. And beside him, hovering just behind like a guilty shadow, was her Nina Sloan. She wore a thin cardigan over a silk dress, her expression a carefully arranged mixture of regret and fear. "Vivian," Richard started, his tone halfway between command and plea. "We need to talk." Evelyn appeared behind me, wine glass in hand, her expression all ice. "You can talk from the driveway, Richard." He ignored her and took a step forward. "This is ridiculous. You've frozen the accounts, had me served, and now you've humiliated me in front of half of Hollow Bay." I cut him off. "Correction, you humiliated yourself. I simply opened the curtains." He blinked, thrown by my calm. "You've gone too far." Nina's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Vivian, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It got complicated." Evelyn snorted. "Affairs usually do." I studied Nina. She was the kind of woman Richard had always been drawn to, youthful, ambitious, and dazzled by his charm until she realized it was just hunger in disguise. "Tell me," I asked softly, "did he promise you the house on Cliffside Drive? The vacation place in Carmel? Or just the fantasy of a man brave enough to leave his wife?" Her face flushed. I thought he was separated." "Of course you did," Evelyn murmured dryly. Richard's temper finally snapped. "Enough, you don't get to moralize. You've always needed control, Vivian. Always watching, always calculating. Maybe that's why this marriage died." "Interesting," I said, stepping closer. "Because according to the court documents, it didn't die, it was murdered. By you." He stiffened. "What are you talking about?" "The prenup, Richard. The fidelity clause. It's binding. You breached it the moment you transferred money to Nina's account. Every dollar, every dinner, every hotel receipt, they're all evidence of infidelity." Nina turned sharply toward him. "You what?" He froze. "Nina, you told me you hadn't—" She stopped herself, voice trembling. "You said your marriage was over. You said—" Her voice broke. For a moment, pity flickered in me, then vanished. Evelyn crossed her arms. "Seems our guest didn't know she was the investment that defaulted." Nina spun on her heel, her voice rising. "You used me, you absolute." She didn't finish the sentence. She just walked down the porch steps and disappeared into the fog. Richard turned back to me, his face pale with fury. "You'll regret this, Vivian." "No," I said quietly. "You will, starting tomorrow." He opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, Clara's voice drifted from behind me, steady, cold, older than her 22 years. "Det, go home." He froze. She was standing there in the hallway, barefoot, her graduation gown draped like a forgotten relic over the couch. "Clara, don't," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You blew up our family today. You don't get to play the victim tonight." Richard's shoulders slumped, the fight leaking out of him. "You'll understand one day," he said quietly. "I already do," she answered. "You taught me what love isn't." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind scraping through the palms outside. Then, slowly, Richard turned and walked down the steps, vanishing into the fog where Nina had gone. Evelyn closed the door behind him and locked it. The silence that followed was immense, the kind that only comes after a storm. Clara leaned against me, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "Mom," she whispered, "what happens now?" I looked toward the window, where the faintest glimmer of dawn was breaking over the water. "Now," I said softly, "we rebuild without pretending anymore." And somewhere in the distance, a gull cried, sharp and haunting, as if punctuating the end of an era. The courthouse in Delcrest stood like a stern reminder that truth, however painful, eventually demands daylight. Its gray stone facade was streaked with salt from the ocean wind. As I stepped inside with my attorney, Philip Anders, the air smelled faintly of rain and bleach, like a place that had seen too many human mistakes scrubbed into record. "Remember," Philip murmured, adjusting his glasses, "keep your tone measured. The judge we're seeing today, Judge Kramer, doesn't tolerate theatrics." I smiled faintly. Theatrics were always Richard's department. Richard was already seated inside, his posture slouched in the first row, his tie crooked. Gone was the polished veneer of the man who once thrived on commanding attention. He looked smaller somehow, his confidence corroded by exposure. I could see the faint tremor in his hand as he whispered frantically to his lawyer, a young associate whose briefcase looked heavier than his experience. Judge Kramer entered. The shuffle of feet stilled. Her voice was brisk, sharp-edged, the kind that could cut marble. "Case number 16 to 4,371. Hartley versus Hartley. Petition for temporary injunction and account freeze. Let's begin." Philip rose. "Your Honor, we submit evidence of systematic fund transfers made by Mr. Hartley over a 12-month period, totaling $86,000. These transactions, as documented, directly violated the full disclosure clause of the prenuptial agreement. Additionally, the evidence establishes marital infidelity, which activates the fidelity provision under Section 12. He handed the documents to the clerk. Judge Kramer leafed through them, expression unreadable. "Mr. Hartley's counsel, do you contest the validity of the agreement?" The young attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, given that nearly 3 decades have passed since the agreement's signing, we argue the document's enforceability has—" "Section 18, the judge interrupted, her voice even. "Duration, for the life of the marriage and any legal dissolution thereof. That means the agreement is still binding." The lawyer hesitated. Richard leaned forward, whispering urgently. Kramer continued. "Furthermore, the court finds that the plaintiff's evidence demonstrates both breach of fiduciary trust and misuse of marital funds. Accordingly, the joint accounts will remain frozen pending full discovery. Mrs. Hartley will retain residence at the Cliffside property until the final hearing." The gavel struck once, the sound echoing like thunder. Richard's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitened against the edge of the table. "This is outrageous," he muttered, too loud. The judge turned her gaze toward him, cold and cutting. "What's outrageous, Mr. Hartley, is attempting to defraud your spouse and then feigning indignation when the law doesn't bend in your favor." A ripple of quiet amusement ran through the gallery. When the hearing adjourned, I gathered my folder and turned to leave. Richard caught up to me in the hallway, his voice lower now, desperate. "Vivian, please. We don't have to do this in court. Let's just talk." I paused, facing him fully for the first time since the restaurant. His eyes searched mine for something pity, nostalgia, weakness. "There was a time," I said softly, "when you could have talked to me. You chose deceit instead. Now, we talk through lawyers." He flinched. "You're really going to take everything?" "No," I said, "just what's mine." He swallowed hard, and for the first time, I saw the faint sheen of tears in his eyes. But I wasn't moved. Pity was a luxury I'd long since spent. When I stepped out into the coastal air, the fog had burned off. The ocean glittered in the distance, relentless, cleansing. Evelyn was waiting by the car, leaning against the hood. "How'd it go?" I smiled faintly. "Better than justice. It went right." As we drove back toward Hollow Bay, I looked out at the waves crashing below the cliffs and thought, the tide always comes for what doesn't belong on the shore. By the second week after the hearing, Richard's carefully varnished image began to splinter like sun-dried driftwood. Hollow Bay's social circles, tight, glittering, and viciously observant, moved fast when the scent of scandal hit salt air. He'd been the charming husband at fundraisers, the guest speaker at business luncheons, the man who bragged about his wife's intuition, like it was a family heirloom. Now, whispers chased him through every cafe and boardroom: embezzlement, infidelity clause, frozen accounts. It was poetic justice, and Hollow Bay had always loved poetry. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Justice, when it's clean, doesn't need applause. Instead, I stayed busy. I spent the mornings on the terrace overlooking the ocean, reading through financial documents Philip sent for the final hearing. In the afternoons, I drove down to the community college in Delcrest, where I began teaching a free seminar, Financial Clarity for Women in Transition. 10 women came to the first session, some divorced, some widowed, some just tired of not understanding the accounts their husbands managed. Their stories were raw, familiar, and quietly powerful. "I used to think budgeting was nagging," one woman confessed. I smiled. "No," I said. "Budgeting is knowing where your freedom lives." Every session, I felt a little more whole. Teaching them wasn't charity. It was reclamation of purpose, of self, of dignity. Then one morning, Evelyn called. Her tone was smug but edged with warning. "You might want to sit down," she said. Cassandra moved out. He blinked. "Already?" She found out Richard's business isn't what she thought. Apparently, he was using her as leverage for a new investor deal. When the accounts froze, so did the charm. A quiet laugh escaped me. "Well, he always did prefer high-risk ventures." Evelyn chuckled. "He's been spotted at the marina living on that old boat he bought a few years ago, the one he called the Renewal." The irony wasn't lost on me. That evening, I received a message from Clara. "Dad called. He wants to meet. Says it's about closure." Closure. The word sat heavy on my tongue, like something too polished to be trusted. "Do you want me to come?" I asked. "No," she replied. "He asked to meet alone. I think he's finally scared." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I poured myself a glass of Merlot and walked out to the balcony. The Pacific stretched before me, endless and indifferent. Somewhere far below, the tide dragged across the rocks, steady, unbothered, eternal. I wondered if closure was ever really possible between two people who had built a life on unequal ground. Could there be forgiveness when there had been so much calculation? Or was it like trying to rebuild a bridge that had long since burned to ash? The next morning, I met him anyway. We chose a cafe on Main Street, public enough to ensure civility. He looked smaller than I remembered a man, eroded by his own decisions. "Vivian," he began, hands trembling around his coffee cup. I didn't realize how far things had gone. I made mistakes. "Stop," I said gently. "You didn't make mistakes. You made choices." He swallowed hard. "I lost everything." I leaned back. "No, you lost me. Everything else was collateral." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the waves crashed, the sound steady and unchanging. Finally, I stood. "I hope one day you understand the difference between love and ownership," I said. Then I left him there, alone at the table, staring into a cup that had long gone cold. That evening, as I walked along the cliffs behind my home, the sun dipped low, staining the water crimson and gold. I thought of the years I had spent waiting for peace to arrive through someone else's approval. Now, I knew better. Peace was something you built ledger by ledger, truth by truth, step by quiet step, and I was just getting started. By mid-July, the air along the California coast had grown heavy with that peculiar summer stillness, a humid lull before the next wave of gossip. In Hollow Bay, silence was never peace. It was the inhale before the next whisper. The rumor mill was relentless. Richard Hartley, once the toast of the Chamber of Commerce, was now the scandal everyone savored. They said his business was collapsing. They said Cassandra had drained what little remained of his accounts before vanishing to Los Angeles. They said I had orchestrated it all like a general planning a war. They were half right. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it didn't matter what people believed, that truth was its own quiet defense. But one morning, as I left the market, I overheard two women near the produce stand, their voices low but not low enough. "Did you hear? She ruined him on purpose. Poor Richard. She's teaching finance classes now as if she needs the money." "Please," the other replied, slicing into a melon sample. "She's playing savior after destroying her husband. That woman's colder than the Pacific." I didn't stop walking, but I did smile. If being called cold meant I had finally stopped bleeding for others, I would wear the title like a medal. That evening, Evelyn came over with a bottle of white wine and a stack of printed articles. "You've gone viral," she said with a smirk. "What?" She set the pages on my kitchen island. A local lifestyle blog had run a story titled, "The Ice Widow of Hollow Bay, Betrayed Wife or Financial Assassin." I read the first few lines, laughter bubbling up despite myself. It was dramatic, even theatrical. The writer had spun me into some calculating anti-heroine who had methodically dismantled her husband's empire with a smile and a glass of Chardonnay. "Poetic," I murmured, pouring us both wine. "And wildly inaccurate," Evelyn grinned. Don't correct them. Let the myth work for you. I'm not interested in myths. Maybe not, she said, but they're interested in you. The following week, I received a letter handwritten, postmarked from San Francisco. It was from a woman named Lydia Tran, editor of a financial wellness publication. She'd read about the case and wanted to feature me in an interview series called Women Who Reclaimed Their Power. At first, I hesitated. Public attention had always been Richard's addiction, not mine. But then I thought of the women who had come to my seminar, their nervous laughter, their timid questions about money, the way their shoulders straightened when they realized knowledge wasn't a privilege. I said yes. The interview took place in a small cafe by the bay. Lydia was gentle but thorough, her questions weaving through my story like a patient seamstress. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't vilify Richard. I spoke about accountability, about partnership, about how women were too often expected to trust instead of verify. When the article was published, it spread further than I'd imagined. Emails began trickling into my inbox from strangers, from women across the country. Your story gave me courage to check our finances. I filed for divorce today. Thank you for reminding me I'm not crazy. You made me realize control isn't cruelty. Each message was a small echo of something larger, a quiet revolution. But success has a way of drawing shadows. One morning, Clara called, her voice trembling. Mom, Dad showed up at my office. My heart stilled. Did he hurt you? No, she said quickly. He was different, quiet. He said he just wanted to talk. Said he's trying to make things right. I exhaled. Did you let him? Only for a minute. He looks lost, Mom. Really lost. Lost. The word hung between us like a ghost. After the call, I stood by the balcony, watching the ocean churn below. The wind had picked up, salt spray stinging my face. For the first time, pity flickered faint but real. Not for the man he had become, but for the one he'd never grown into. Still, pity was not permission. That night, I wrote a note to myself in my journal. Forgiveness is not reopening the door. It's closing it without bitterness. And for the first time, I truly understood what peace tasted like. Not sweet, not soft, but clean. Like the sharp air after a storm. The morning of the final settlement hearing dawned cold and colorless, the kind of day when the Pacific seemed to hold its breath. I arrived early, not out of anxiety, but habit years of managing other people's chaos had trained me to seek control and precision. Richard was late. Typical. When he finally walked into the courtroom, I barely recognized him. The man who once obsessed over presentation now looked as though he'd aged 10 years in 2 months. His once smooth confidence had eroded into something brittle, a careful facade cracking under pressure. Nina was not with him. Word around town said she had fled to Los Angeles, reinventing herself under another man's name. The Hollow Bay rumor mill churned fast, and she had become its latest casualty. Judge Kramer entered. The scrape of chairs ceased. Mrs. Hartley, she said, glancing over the paperwork before her. We've reviewed the financial disclosures, the property records, and the prenuptial agreement. The evidence supports the validity of the fidelity clause. Based on this, the court awards you full ownership of the cliffside property and 70% of the remaining joint assets. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Mr. Hartley, the judge continued, her tone sharp but not unkind, you'll retain your personal business accounts and retirement fund. You will also be responsible for all outstanding debts accrued in your company's name. Any further interference with the plaintiff's finances will result in immediate legal action. The gavel came down. One clean strike, the sound of finality. Richard didn't move. His lawyer gathered the documents quietly, like a man sweeping ashes into a box. When the session adjourned, Richard rose slowly and approached me, his expression strangely calm. You win, he said softly. I studied him. This wasn't a game, Richard. He hesitated. I thought I could control the story. That if I left first, I'd look like the one with courage. But you planned it better. I looked at him, truly looked not the man I'd loved, but the one who had underestimated me for almost 3 decades. I didn't plan revenge, I said. I planned survival. He nodded, eyes glassy. I was cruel. Yes. I met his gaze without flinching. But cruelty only hurts the kind. It doesn't destroy them. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. Then, softly, he said, I missed the sound of your voice in the morning. that sound stopped belonging to you the day you lied with it." He didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, shoulders slumped, a man shrinking from his own reflection. Outside, the afternoon light was thin, stretched across the water like pale silk. Evelyn was waiting by the courthouse steps, her expression unreadable. "So?" she asked. "It's done," I said. "The chapter is closed." She handed me a paper cup of coffee, steam rising into the wind. "And how does it feel, the end of a 28-year story?" I took a sip and let the bitterness roll across my tongue. "Like breathing after a long swim." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You know, they're already calling you the widow of Hollow Bay." "Widow?" I raised an eyebrow. "Not literally, just the way the town tells it, a woman who buried her marriage and built an empire from the bones." I laughed softly. "People will always choose the legend over the truth. The legend's easier to envy." That night, I walked through the house on Cliffside Drive, my house barefoot, the hardwood cool beneath my feet. The air smelled of sea salt and lemon oil. I passed the framed photos on the wall, the ones I hadn't yet taken down, and paused in front of one. Richard, Clara, and me in Santa Barbara, all smiles under a bright blue sky. I didn't feel rage or sorrow, just a quiet sense of release, like exhaling a name I'd carried too long. Later, I sat by the balcony, the ocean roaring below. I opened my laptop and began drafting an outline for something new. The Hartley Foundation for Women in Finance, supporting independence through knowledge. A year ago, I might have written it for Clara's future. Tonight, I wrote it for mine. In the distance, lightning flickered over the horizon, a storm miles away, breaking over dark water. I watched it without fear. I'd already weathered worse. By the time the first autumn rains came to Hollow Bay, the story of my divorce had already become something else, an allegory whispered among the women of the coast. She didn't just survive, they said. She turned survival into a strategy. It wasn't fame I wanted. It was momentum. The Hartley Foundation for Women in Finance opened its doors in early October, operating out of a renovated space above an old bookstore downtown. The place smelled of cedar and coffee. The windows faced the ocean, and when the fog rolled in, it felt as though the whole world disappeared, except the women sitting inside, each one with a notebook, a nervous smile, and a story that began the same way. I never learned how to handle money. He always did that. There were 20 women that first month, widows, divorcees, single mothers, some from wealth, others barely scraping by. Each one brought her own quiet fear, the same kind of fear I had lived with for half my life. I stood before them, chalk dust on my hands, numbers on the board, and said, "This isn't about finance, it's about freedom." The room went still. A few nodded. One woman, thin, gray-haired, clutching a thrift store handbag, started to cry softly. That was when I knew the foundation was no longer just my project. It was my penance, my rebirth. Outside those walls, however, the ghosts of the past lingered. Richard had left Hollow Bay. He sold what remained of his business and reportedly moved inland to a small apartment near Santa Rosa. Clara told me he called once every few weeks, his voice subdued, fragile. "He sounds like he's trying," she said during one visit. "Like he's humbled." "Good," I said simply, though inside I wasn't sure what to feel. Compassion, maybe, but compassion and forgiveness are not the same thing. One evening, after teaching a late seminar, I locked up the office and walked along the boardwalk. The tide was high, waves slapping against the pylons, the air thick with sea spray. I passed the restaurant where it had all begun, the Sea Glass. Its windows glowed with golden light, laughter spilling into the night. For a moment, I paused. The smell of rosemary and ocean salt filled my lungs, and I felt no bitterness, just distance. The woman who had once sat at that table, dutiful wife, loyal partner, polite hostage, was gone. 2 weeks later, the foundation received its first major donation, $150,000 from an anonymous benefactor. Evelyn was convinced it was one of the women from my early seminars, someone whose life had changed. I wasn't so sure. The note attached was brief, written in a familiar, careful script. "For the cause that should have always been yours, may it outlive every mistake I made. R.H." My hands trembled as I read it. I said nothing to Evelyn or Clara. Some debts, after all, were meant to be paid in silence. That winter, the foundation expanded its program. We began offering free consultations for women undergoing divorce proceedings. I trained younger financial advisors, teaching them not just to analyze assets, but to read patterns of control, how power hides in generosity, how manipulation dresses itself as protection. Every story that crossed my desk echoed my own, but with small variations: a different husband, a different betrayal, the same imbalance. And every time a woman signed her first independent lease or opened her own account, I felt something shift inside me, a ledger balancing not in dollars, but in dignity. On the first anniversary of the foundation's opening, we held a small gathering. No media, no speeches, just the women who had found their footing again. The walls were strung with lights, the tables filled with food everyone had brought from home. Clara gave a toast strong, poised, luminous. "To my mother," she said, lifting her glass, "who taught me that freedom isn't loud, it's steady." I swallowed against the knot in my throat, smiling through the sting of tears. As the night ended, I stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the ocean. The wind was cold, sharp with salt. Below, the waves clawed at the cliffs, relentless and alive. The house on Cliffside Drive glowed faintly in the distance, a lighthouse in the dark. It no longer symbolized the life I'd lost. It was simply the place I returned to when I needed to remember that endings, when done right, could be as exquisite as beginnings. The year turned slowly, the way winter on the California coast always does, less with snow than with fog, a softness that blurs everything it touches. My days followed a quiet rhythm: morning walks by the water, afternoons at the foundation, evenings on the balcony with a book and a glass of wine. Peace had a sound now. It was the ocean. Sometimes, I still caught myself waiting for Richard's name to appear on my phone, a remnant of the old reflexes that had shaped my life. But the silence that replaced him didn't ache anymore. It expanded. One evening, after a long seminar, I returned home to find a small box on my doorstep. No name, no note. Inside was a simple silver bracelet engraved on the inside. "Freedom isn't revenge, it's balance." I didn't need a signature to know who it was from. I didn't call him either. Instead, I placed the bracelet in the top drawer of my desk, beside the copy of our old prenup, the document that had once chained me and later set me free. I didn't keep it as a trophy. I kept it as a reminder. Control, once reclaimed, must be guarded. That winter, Clara moved to San Francisco for a new job at an environmental nonprofit. Before she left, she spent one last weekend with me at Cliffside Drive. We sat by the fire, eating pasta and laughing about things that used to feel too heavy to joke about. "You know," she said between bites, "sometimes I think Dad's story is sadder than ours." "How so?" "He can't forgive himself," she said simply. "You did. That's the difference." I thought about that for a long moment. "Forgiveness isn't kindness," I said. "It's release. You forgive so you can stop carrying the wreckage." She nodded, eyes glistening in the firelight. "Then I guess you're finally free." In early February, the foundation received a call from a legal firm in Los Angeles. One of the women we'd helped, an elderly widow named Mrs. Devereaux, had left a significant bequest to the organization in her will. Enough to keep us running for years. Evelyn and I went to the coast that weekend to celebrate. The sea was wild, churning whitecaps under a storm-gray sky. We walked barefoot at the edge of the surf, shoes in hand. "You realize," she said, "you've become what they used to call you behind your back." I smiled. "A wife?" "No," she said, laughing. "A force." That night, I dreamed of the restaurant again, the glittering glasses, the still air, the faces frozen in shock. But this time, when Richard raised his glass and made his declaration, I wasn't sitting at the table. I was standing outside, watching through the glass, already gone. When I woke, the dawn light was spilling across the room, soft and gold. The ocean beyond the windows shimmered like a new promise. I made myself tea, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and stood by the balcony. From here, the world stretched infinitely forward, hills rolling into mist, the sea breathing against the cliffs. It struck me then. The story of my life hadn't ended the day my marriage did. That was only the middle. The real story began the day I stopped defining myself by what I had lost and started building from what remained. Freedom wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, deliberate. Like the tide. Like me. That night, before bed, I opened my journal and wrote, "Peace is not the absence of pain, but the presence of choice. And this time, every choice is mine." I closed the journal, turned off the lamp, and let the sound of the waves carry me to sleep.